We all have moments from our past that we carry like treasures, even when we think we've forgotten them. Sometimes the smallest promises hold the greatest power to heal a broken heart. 18 years ago, a 6-year-old peasant girl looked up at a lonely duke and declared she would marry him when she grew up. He smiled at her innocent words before riding away to war and grief. The years passed slowly in his crumbling castle, and he grew old, believing that hope was something for younger men. But on one autumn evening, footsteps echoed across his empty courtyard. The little girl had returned, now a woman, carrying nothing but her childhood promise and a heart that had never forgotten. What happens when someone keeps a vow the rest of the world would call foolish? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I would notice, she said quietly. Thomas would notice. The people in the village would notice. You're still needed here, whether you believe it or not. After she left, Aldrich rose and walked to the window that overlooked the village below. Raven's Hollow had once been a thriving community of farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. Now half the houses stood empty, their windows dark, gardens gone to seed. The young people had left for opportunities in larger cities, leaving behind only the old and the stubborn, those too rooted to the land to abandon it, even as it seemed to abandon them. He remembered a different time, 18 years past, when duty had called him from these walls. The memory came unbidden, as it often did in the quiet hours of evening. He had been 27 then, newly widowed, his beloved Ilara taken by fever just 2 years into their marriage. The pain had been so fresh, so raw, that he welcomed the king's summons to war as a chance to escape the ghosts that haunted every corner of the castle. Before departing, he had made his rounds through the village, ensuring his people would be cared for in his absence. That was when he met her, a slip of a girl with tangled brown hair and eyes the color of spring grass, dirt smudged on her cheeks, and determination written in every line of her small frame. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, standing before the modest cottage where her parents struggled to make ends meet. "You're the Duke," she had said, with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Not a question, but a statement. A fact delivered without fear or deference. "I am," he had replied, dismounting from his horse to speak with her properly. Something about her fearless gaze had compelled him to treat her as an equal rather than dismiss her as he might have any other child. "My name is Leora," she announced. "Leora Ashworth, and when I grow up I'm going to marry you." The declaration had been so unexpected, so charmingly earnest, that he had laughed for the first time since Ilara's death. "Is that so? And why would you want to marry an old man like me?" She had considered this seriously, her small brow furrowed in thought. "Because you look sad, and I don't think anyone should be sad all the time. When I'm grown up, I'll make you happy again." Her parents had appeared then, mortified by their daughter's bold words, apologizing profusely for her presumption. But Aldrich had waved away their concerns, oddly touched by the child's innocent confidence. "I'll hold you to that promise, young Leora," he had said gently, producing a small wooden ring he had carved years earlier as a toy. "Consider this a token of our agreement." She had accepted the simple ring with the solemnity of a queen receiving a crown, slipping it onto her tiny finger where it hung loose but proud. "I promise," she had said. "I'll come back when I'm grown up and we'll be married, and you won't be sad anymore." He had ridden away the next morning, carrying with him the memory of her bright smile and earnest promise. War had claimed his attention for 3 years. A brutal campaign that had tested every skill he possessed as a commander. When he finally returned, victorious but forever changed by what he had seen and done, he had asked after the Ashworth family. They were gone. Disease had taken the parents within months of his departure, and the child had been sent away to distant relatives. No one knew where, And in the chaos of a duchy trying to rebuild after years without its lord, the fate of one orphaned peasant girl had seemed a small tragedy among many. Now, standing at his window in the gathering dusk, Aldrich touched the glass with weathered fingers and wondered what had become of the bright-eyed child who had promised to marry him. She would be a woman now, 24 years old, probably married to some farmer or tradesman, with children of her own and no memory of the foolish promise she had made to a grieving duke. The castle felt especially empty tonight, its silence pressing down on him like a physical weight. He had grown accustomed to solitude, even found a certain comfort in it, but sometimes the loneliness cut so deep it took his breath away. He was the last of his line, with no heir to carry on the Thorn name, no legacy beyond crumbling stones and fading memories. A sound from the courtyard below drew his attention, the clip-clop of horse hooves on cobblestone. Visitors were rare enough to be noteworthy, especially at this hour. He watched as a lone figure dismounted near the main gate, moving with the confident grace of someone accustomed to travel. Even in the dim light, he could see it was a woman, though her simple traveling clothes and practical manner suggested she was no noble lady. Thomas emerged from the stables, his movements hurried, as he greeted the unexpected arrival. Aldrich couldn't hear their conversation from his window, but he saw the old man's surprise, saw him gesture toward the castle with what appeared to be recognition. Martha's voice called from the hallway below, urgent and breathless in a way that sent a chill of unease down his spine. Your Grace! Your Grace! You must come quickly!" He left the window and made his way downstairs, finding Martha in the great hall with an expression he had never seen on her face. Wonder, mixed with disbelief, as if she had witnessed something miraculous. "What is it, Martha? What's wrong?" She opened her mouth to speak, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, she simply gestured toward the main entrance, where Thomas was approaching with the stranger from the courtyard. As they drew nearer, Aldrich felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The woman who walked beside his faithful retainer was tall and graceful, with rich brown hair that caught the light and eyes that held the same bright intelligence he remembered from 18 years past. She wore a simple brown traveling dress and carried herself with quiet dignity, but there was no mistaking the determined set of her shoulders or the fearless way she met his gaze. "Your Grace," Thomas said, his voice filled with an emotion Aldrich couldn't name. "May I present Miss Leora Ashworth? She says she's come home." For a long moment, Aldrich could only stare, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman before him with the memory of a 6-year-old child. She was beautiful, undeniably. But it was a beauty born of character rather than mere physical perfection. There was strength in the line of her jaw, wisdom in her steady gaze, and something else, a warmth that seemed to chase away the shadows that had settled so permanently in the corners of his heart. "Hello, Your Grace," she said, and her voice was exactly as he might have imagined it would become, soft but sure, with the same fearless confidence that had charmed him so long ago. "I've come to keep my promise." The wooden ring she had worn as a child now hung on a simple chain around her neck, visible at the hollow of her throat, like a declaration of faith that had survived 18 years of separation and change. Aldrich found his voice at last, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Leora, you came back." "I said I would," she replied simply. "I've never broken a promise in my life, Your Grace. I didn't intend to start now." The silence that followed Leora's words stretched between them like a bridge neither was certain how to cross. Aldrich stood frozen, his mind reeling with possibilities and impossibilities in equal measure. The woman before him bore little resemblance to the dirt-smudged child of his memory, yet something in her eyes, that unwavering directness, that fearless honesty, was unmistakably the same. Martha broke the spell first, stepping forward with the practical concern that had guided her through 3 decades of service. "Miss Ashworth, you must be exhausted from your journey. Have you travelled far?" "From the northern provinces," Leora replied, though her gaze never left Aldrich's face. It's been a long road, but I'm here now. She reached into the well-worn leather satchel slung across her shoulder and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. I brought medicine in case it was needed. Word travels, even to distant places, about sickness in these parts. The casual mention of medicine sparked something in Aldrich's consciousness, pulling him from his shocked stupor. "You're a healer?" "Among other things." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "I've learned many skills over the years, Your Grace. I thought they might prove useful when I returned." Thomas cleared his throat softly. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but perhaps we should move this conversation somewhere more comfortable. The evening air grows cold, and Miss Ashworth has been travelling." Aldrich nodded, though his movements felt strangely disconnected from his thoughts. "Of course. Martha, please prepare the blue chamber." "The servants' quarters will suit me perfectly," Leora interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm not here as a guest seeking favor, Your Grace. I'm here as someone who owes a debt." "A debt?" The word came, out sharper than he intended. 18 years of disappointment and broken trust had taught him to be wary of those who claimed to owe him anything. "What debt could you possibly owe me?" For the first time since her arrival, uncertainty flickered across her features. "Perhaps we might speak privately. What I have to say is not for general ears." Martha and Thomas exchanged glances, recognizing the dismissal for what it was. The old housekeeper had served nobility long enough to read the undercurrents of delicate situations. "I'll prepare some refreshments," Martha said diplomatically. "The blue chamber, as His Grace suggested. No arguments, miss. You're a guest in this house, and guests are treated properly under this roof." After the servants departed, Aldrich led Leora into his study, the room that had become his refuge from the world. The lamplight cast warm shadows across the book-lined walls and highlighted the accumulated evidence of his solitary existence. Half-finished correspondence, ledgers filled with sobering numbers, and the bronze medal that had become a paperweight. For documents that seemed to matter less with each passing day. Leora moved through the space with careful attention, her eyes taking in details with the practiced observation of someone accustomed to learning about people through their surroundings. She paused before the window that overlooked the village, her expression growing thoughtful. "You can see the decline from here," she said quietly. "The empty houses, the untended fields. It must pain you greatly to watch. You seem remarkably well-informed about matters that shouldn't concern a—" He stopped himself before completing the sentence, realizing how it would sound. "Oh, peasant," she finished without rancor. "I may have been born in humble circumstances, Your Grace, but I've spent 18 years preparing for this moment. Did you think I would return without understanding what I was walking into?" The directness of her response caught him off guard. In his experience, people who wanted something from him, and surely she must want something, approached with flattery and careful manipulation, not blunt honesty. "What exactly are you walking into?" he asked. "And more importantly, why?" She turned from the window to face him fully, and in the lamplight he could see the determined set of her jaw, the steady resolve in her green eyes. "I'm walking into a promise I made as a child to a man who showed me kindness when he had no reason to do so. As for why," she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Because some promises transcend circumstances, Your Grace. Because keeping one's word matters more than comfort or convenience." "You were 6 years old," Aldrich said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Children say many things they don't mean. No one would hold you to such words." "I would hold myself to them." The simple statement carried a weight that silenced his objections. "Your Grace, may I speak plainly?" He gestured for her to continue, though part of him dreaded what she might say. 18 years ago, you gave a grieving child hope when she needed it most. My parents had just died. I was about to be sent away from everything I knew, and the world felt dark and frightening. You listened to me as if my words mattered. You treated me with dignity when you could have dismissed me as an annoyance. That kindness, it stayed with me through everything that followed. The words hit him like physical blows. He had been so lost in his own grief back then, he had barely remembered the encounter until tonight. To learn that it had meant so much. To her, that she had carried it with her all these years. "Where did you go?" he asked abruptly. "After your parents died." "To my mother's sister in Northford. She was a healer, a wise woman who taught me to read, to use herbs for medicine, to see beyond the surface of things." Leora's expression grew distant with memory. "She told me that promises made in love are sacred, even when the world tells us they're foolish, especially then. And she encouraged this madness?" A flash of something, pain, disappointment, crossed her features before the calm mask returned. "She taught me to follow my heart while using my head, to prepare myself to be worthy of the vows I made." She lifted her chin slightly. "I spent 18 years learning everything I could about managing estates, treating illness, reading people, and situations. I'm not the helpless child you remember, Your Grace. I'm a woman who has come to honor her commitments." Aldrich moved to his desk, his hands gripping the edge as he tried to process what she was telling him. The rational part of his mind insisted this was impossible, that no one honored childhood promises made in grief and innocence. But looking at her, seeing the quiet strength in her bearing, the unwavering certainty in her voice, he found his skepticism warring with something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. And that terrified him more than any enemy he had faced in war. "What do you expect from me?" he asked finally. "What do you want me to say?" "I don't expect anything," she replied. "I ask only for the chance to prove that my words aren't empty. Let me stay, Your Grace. Let me help with whatever needs doing. If, after a reasonable time, you find my presence unwelcome or my assistance inadequate, I'll leave with no argument. And if I refuse, if I tell you to leave now..." The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither fully understood. Leora was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a sadness that made his chest tight. "Then, I'll go. But I'll know I kept my word, even if nothing came of it." She met his eyes directly. "Some promises are worth keeping simply because we made them, Your Grace. The outcome doesn't change the value of the commitment." Before he could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway with a soft knock. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but I've prepared the blue chamber. Miss Ashworth's things have been brought up, and there's a hot meal waiting when she's ready." Leora inclined her head gratefully. "Thank you, Mrs. Martha will do fine, miss. I've been looking after this castle longer than I care to count." "Then thank you, Martha. Your kindness is most appreciated." As Leora moved toward the door, Aldrich found himself speaking before he had consciously decided to do so. "Stay." She paused, turning back with raised eyebrows. "Stay," he repeated, the word carrying more weight than he had intended. "For now, we'll see how things go." The smile that transformed her face was like sunrise after a long night, bright enough to chase away shadows he hadn't even realized were there. "Thank you, Your Grace. You won't regret this." After she left with Martha, Aldrich sank into his chair and stared at the bronze medal on his desk. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the castle didn't feel quite so empty. The silence was different now, expectant rather than resigned, charged with possibilities he didn't dare name. Outside his window, the village lights flickered like distant stars, and somewhere in the blue chamber above, a woman who had kept an impossible promise was settling into a life she had spent 18 years preparing to claim. Aldrich touched the medal with one finger, remembering the weight of duty and honor it represented. He had thought those days were behind him, that he was too old and too tired for new responsibilities or fresh starts. Perhaps he had been wrong. Perhaps it was. Never too late for second chances, even for men who had forgotten how to believe in them. Dawn came to Ravenshollow with the gentle persistence of hope itself, and with it the sound of purposeful activity that the castle hadn't heard in years. Aldrich woke to voices in the courtyard below, not the hushed tones of servants going about. their duties, but something livelier, more animated. He dressed quickly and made his way to the window where he found the source of the commotion. Leora knelt in what had once been the castle's herb garden, her simple brown dress already stained with earth, her sleeves rolled up to reveal capable hands working among the overgrown plants. Martha stood nearby, gesturing and explaining, while Thomas leaned on his walking stick and nodded approvingly at whatever plans were being discussed. The herb garden had been Ilara's pride, a carefully tended space where she had grown medicinal plants and culinary herbs for the castle's use. After her death, Aldrich had been unable to bear the sight of it and had ordered it left alone. Over the years, neglect had transformed it into a tangle of weeds and wild growth, with only the hardiest plants surviving in recognizable form. Now, watching Leora carefully examine a struggling stand of chamomile, he felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. She moved through the space with reverent attention, as if she understood the love that had once been poured into this earth. "Your Grace," Martha's voice came from the doorway behind him. "Forgive the intrusion, but Miss Ashworth has requested permission to restore the herb garden. She says it would be useful for her healing work." Aldrich turned from the window, noting the careful neutrality in Martha's tone. The old housekeeper was too wise to push, but he could see the hope in her eyes, the same hope he felt stirring treacherously in his own chest. "What does she know about herb gardens?" he asked, though his question came out gentler than he had intended. "More than most, I'd say." Martha's smile was knowing. She identified every plant still growing, including some I'd forgotten were there. Says her aunt taught her well. When Aldrich made his way down to the garden, he found Leora examining a gnarled rosemary bush with the focused attention of a scholar studying an ancient text. She looked up at his approach, her face bright with the enthusiasm of someone discovering unexpected treasures. "Your Grace," she said, rising and brushing dirt from her hands, "I hope you don't mind my taking liberties with your garden. Martha mentioned it had been abandoned, and I thought it was my wife's garden," he said quietly. "She spent hours here every day." The words brought Leora up short, and he saw understanding dawn in her green eyes. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize. I can leave it as it is." "No." The word came out more firmly than he had expected. "No. Ilara would have hated to see it like this. She believed plants were meant to heal and nourish, not waste away from neglect." He paused, looking at the wild tangle around them. What would it take to restore it properly? Leora's expression grew thoughtful as she surveyed the space. "Time, mostly. Many of the original plants are still here, just overgrown and competing. With weeds, the soil is good, it just needs care and attention." She gestured toward a corner where several small pots sat in neat rows. "I brought some seedlings with me. Feverfew, comfrey, willow bark, things that are useful for common ailments." "You came prepared," he observed. "I told you, Your Grace. I spent 18 years getting ready to return." There was no boastfulness in her voice, just quiet certainty. "I wanted to be useful when I got here." Over the following days, Aldrich found himself drawn to the garden with increasing frequency. He told himself he was simply checking on the restoration's progress, but the truth was more complicated. There was something compelling about watching Leora work, the careful way she coaxed struggling plants back to health, the gentle firmness with which she directed the weeding and replanting. More than that, there was the way she spoke about the plants themselves, as if they were old friends rather than mere tools. She explained to Martha which herbs could ease joint pain, taught Thomas how to recognize the signs of blight, and answered Aldrich's questions about medicinal properties with the patience of someone who genuinely loved sharing knowledge. "The previous Duchess had excellent taste," Leora said one afternoon as they worked side by side, clearing weeds from around a patch of mint. "This variety is particularly good for digestive troubles. And see here," she indicated a climbing vine that had nearly been strangled by brambles. "This is rue. Not commonly grown, but invaluable for treating certain women's ailments." "You speak as if you knew her," Aldrich said, carefully not looking at Leora as he worked. "In a way, I feel as if I do. A garden tells you a great deal about its keeper." Leora sat back on her heels, pushing a strand of hair from her face. She was thoughtful, practical. She chose plants that would serve multiple purposes, beautiful to look at, useful for healing, pleasant for cooking. Someone who cared about making life better for the people around her. The simple observation hit him unexpectedly hard. Ilara had been exactly like that. Someone who found joy in small acts of service, who believed that tending to others was the highest calling. It had been one of the things he loved most about her, and one of the things he missed most keenly. "She was," he said quietly. "She used to say that every plant had a purpose, even the ones that seemed like weeds." "She sounds like a wise woman." Leora's voice carried genuine warmth. "I would have liked to meet her." The simple honesty of the statement caught him off guard. There was no jealousy in her tone, no resentment toward the memory of his dead wife. Just sincere regret for a connection that could never be made. "She would have liked you," he found himself saying. "She had a gift for seeing the best in people." They worked in companionable silence after that, but Aldrich found his awareness of her presence intensifying rather than diminishing. There was something calming about her steady concentration, the efficient way she moved among the plants, the occasional soft humming that seemed to come without conscious thought. When the village baker's son arrived with a red, swollen hand, wrapped in dirty cloth, Aldrich watched Leora transform from gardener to healer with seamless competence. She examined the injury, a burn from an overheated oven, with gentle thoroughness, asked careful questions about when it had happened and what had been done for it, then prepared a poultice from herbs she had brought with her. "Keep it clean and dry," she instructed the boy, who couldn't have been more than 14. "Change the dressing twice a day, and if you see any red streaks spreading from the wound, come back immediately. Do you understand?" The boy nodded eagerly, clearly awed by her calm authority. "Yes, miss. Thank you, miss." After he left, Aldrich found himself studying Leora with new appreciation. "You have a gift for that. Practice," she said simply, cleaning her hands in a basin of water Martha had brought. "My aunt saw many patients over the years. I learned by watching and helping. The villagers will hear about this," he warned. "Word travels quickly in small communities." "I hope it does." Her response surprised him. "If people know there's someone here who can help with minor injuries and illnesses, they won't have to travel to the next county for treatment. That's time and money they can't afford to lose." The practical wisdom of her observation struck him forcefully. He had been so focused on his own grief and isolation that he had failed to consider how the lack of a local healer might be affecting his people. The nearest physician was a hard, her day's ride away, expensive to summon and often unable to come quickly in emergencies. "You're thinking of staying permanently," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm thinking of being useful for as long as I'm welcome." She met his gaze directly. "That was always the plan, Your Grace. I didn't come here for a brief visit." That evening, as Aldrich sat in his study reviewing the day's correspondence, he found his attention drifting repeatedly to the window that overlooked the garden. Lantern light flickered among the herb beds where Leora was making final adjustments to a new planting, her movements sure and purposeful even in the gathering darkness. For the first time in years, the castle felt alive with more than just memories. There was energy in the air, possibility in the restored garden, hope in the knowledge that someone was working to make things better rather than simply enduring their decline. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." Martha entered with her usual quiet efficiency, but there was something different in her manner, a lightness that had been absent for far too long. "Miss Ashworth has asked me to give you this," she said, placing a small cloth bundle on his desk. "She said you might find it useful." Inside the bundle was a selection of dried herbs tied with simple string, along with a note written in neat, careful script. "For sleepless nights and troubled thoughts, steep 1 pinch in hot water before bed." Aldrich stared at the modest gift, touched by its thoughtfulness. She had noticed his restless nights, the signs of insomnia that he thought he had hidden from casual observation. The gesture was small but significant, evidence that she saw him as more than just a duty to be fulfilled or a promise to be kept. "She's a good influence on the household," Martha said carefully. "The staff are livelier than they've been in years, and you approve?" Martha's smile was gentle but knowing. "I think the castle needs someone who believes in taking care of things, instead of letting them fade away. But my opinion matters less than yours, Your Grace." After she left, Aldrich held the bundle of herbs and considered the changes that a single day had brought to his ordered, solitary existence. Leora's presence was like a stone thrown into still water, the ripples spreading outward in ways he couldn't predict or control. The question was whether he was brave enough to let those ripples reach him. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the castle's library, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden light like tiny spirits. Aldrich had come here seeking solitude and the familiar comfort of his books, but instead he found Leora curled in the window seat that had been Ilara's favorite reading spot, a leather-bound volume open in her lap. She looked up as he entered, her expression shifting from absorbed concentration to something more guarded. "Your Grace, I hope you don't mind. Martha said I might borrow some books." "Of course." He moved closer, curious despite himself about what had captured her attention so completely. "What are you reading?" She held up the book, a treatise on estate management that he recognized as one of his more practical volumes. "I'm trying to understand the challenges facing Raven's Hollow. The financial records Martha showed me paint a concerning picture." Her directness caught him off guard. Most people, even those closest to him, tiptoed around the duchy's declining fortunes. Martha had no right to share such information. I asked her to. Leora closed the book and met his gaze steadily. "If I'm to be of any use here, I need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Hope without knowledge is just wishful thinking." The quiet authority in her voice made him pause. There was no presumption in her manner, but there was an unmistakable assumption that she belonged here, that his problems were now, in some sense, hers as well. "And what do you think we're dealing with?" he asked, settling into a nearby chair. Leora opened the book again, her finger tracing a column of figures she had apparently committed to memory. Declining agricultural yields due to soil depletion and outdated farming methods, loss of population as young people leave for opportunities elsewhere, reducing both the tax base and available labor, increased costs for materials and goods that must be imported, while the prices for local products remain stagnant. She looked up at him. "Am I missing anything significant?" The accuracy of her assessment was both impressive and unsettling. "You've been here less than a week." "I've been preparing to return for 18 years, she reminded him gently. "I may have grown up in a cottage, Your Grace, but I've spent considerable time learning how estates function and why they fail." Something in her tone made him lean forward. "You have thoughts about solutions." "I have questions first." She set the book aside and turned to face him fully. "What happened to the relationship between the castle and the village? There seems to be a distance that goes beyond the normal hierarchy." The question touched on something that had troubled him for years, though he had been reluctant to examine it too closely. "When I returned from war, I was different, changed. I focused on keeping the duchy running rather than connecting with the people. And when your wife died, the gentle probe made his chest tight. I withdrew further. It seemed easier than facing reminders of what I had lost." Leora nodded thoughtfully. "Grief has a way of building walls we don't realize we're constructing, but walls that keep pain out also keep connection out." Her words hit him with uncomfortable accuracy. He had indeed built walls around his heart, around his daily routine, around his very identity as Duke. The irony was that in trying to protect himself from further loss, he had ensured his continued isolation. "You speak from experience," he observed. "I lost my parents when I was 6, she said simply. "My aunt helped me understand that loving someone doesn't mean their death should stop your living. Sometimes the best way to honor those we've lost is to remain open to those who remain." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Outside the window, Aldrich could see villagers moving about their morning tasks, people he was responsible for but had gradually grown distant from. "Tell me your questions," he said finally. "When did you last visit the village? Not for official business, but simply to see how people are faring?" The question made him realize he couldn't remember. "It's been some time. When did you last hold court? Hear petitions, settle disputes, address concerns?" Another uncomfortable pause. "The village elder handles most local matters." "And when did you last host a harvest festival or a market day, or any gathering that brought people together under the castle's sponsorship?" Each question landed like a gentle but pointed accusation. He had fulfilled his legal obligations as duke, but he had abandoned the social and emotional leadership that bound a lord to his people. "You think I've failed them," he said quietly. "I think you've been surviving rather than living," Leora corrected. "And survival, while admirable, isn't the same as flourishing. Not for you, and not for those who depend on you." Before he could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway with evident agitation. "Your Grace, Lord Blackwood has arrived. He's waiting." In the great hall, Aldrich felt his shoulders tense automatically. Edmund Blackwood was a neighbouring lord whose holdings bordered Ravenshollow to the south. He was younger than Aldrich, ambitious, and possessed of the kind of sharp political instincts that made him both valuable as an ally and dangerous as an enemy. "What does he want?" Aldrich asked, though he suspected he already knew. "He says it's a social call," Martha replied with the tone of someone who didn't believe it for a moment. "He's brought a small party with him, his son, and what appears to be a young lady of some importance." Leora rose from the window seat, smoothing her simple dress. "I should withdraw." "No." The word came out more forcefully than Aldrich had intended. "That is, you're welcome to remain if you wish. Lord Blackwood's visits tend to be educational." Something in his tone made Leora's eyes sharpen with interest rather than concern. "Educational how?" "Edmund has been trying to convince me to marry his ward for the past 2 years. He believes Ravenshollow needs an infusion of new blood and fresh capital." "And you disagree?" Aldrich paused, considering the question more seriously than he had in months. "I've been uncertain. Marriage for political alliance makes sense from a practical standpoint. But," Leora prompted gently, "but I buried one wife I loved deeply. The thought of a marriage without love, no matter how practical." He stopped, suddenly aware of how personal the conversation had become. "Some risks are worth taking," Leora said quietly, "and some aren't." They made their way to the great hall, where Lord Blackwood waited with his characteristic confidence. He was a man in his early 40s, well-dressed and carrying himself with the assurance of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. Beside him stood a young man who was clearly his son, perhaps 25, with the same sharp features and calculating eyes. The third member of their party was a blonde woman of perhaps 20, beautiful in a polished way that spoke of careful cultivation rather than natural grace. "Aldrich." Blackwood's greeting was hearty, though his eyes were already assessing. "You look well. Country living agrees with you, Edmund." Aldrich's response was polite but reserved. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Can't an old friend visit without ulterior motives?" Blackwood's laugh was just a bit too loud. "Though I confess, I do have someone I'd like you to meet properly. Lady Catherine Ashford. May I present Duke Aldrich Thorne of Ravenshollow?" "De courtesy." Young woman curtsied with practiced grace. "Your Grace, Lord Blackwood has told me so much about your duchy. I'm eager to see more of it." Aldrich inclined his head politely, but his attention was caught by the subtle tension he sensed in Leora, who had positioned herself near the wall where she could observe without drawing attention. "And you remember my son Marcus, of course?" Blackwood continued. He's been managing the eastern portion of my holdings, doing quite well with it, I might add. Lord Blackwood. Marcus stepped forward with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Father speaks of you often. He says Ravenshollow has tremendous potential with the right guidance. The phrase right guidance carried implications that Aldrich didn't miss. Before he could respond, Blackwood's gaze fell on Leora, and his expression shifted subtly. I don't believe I've had the pleasure, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Miss Leora Ashworth, Aldrich said, noting how Leora stepped forward with quiet dignity. She's assisting with some restoration projects around the castle. Ashworth. Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. An unusual name for these parts. You're not local, I take it. I grew up here, Leora replied calmly. I've recently returned after an extended absence. Something in her bearing seemed to challenge Blackwood's assumption that she was merely a servant, and Aldrich watched with interest as the man tried to categorize her properly. How rustic, Lady Catherine said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It must be so different from court life. Do you find country society sufficiently stimulating? The question was clearly meant to highlight Leora's presumably inferior background, but if Leora felt the sting, she gave no sign of it. I find purpose quite stimulating, she replied with gentle grace. There's satisfaction in work that improves people's lives. Work. Lady Catherine repeated the word as if it were foreign. How refreshing to meet someone so practical. Aldrich felt a flare of irritation at the condescension in the young woman's voice, but before he could respond, Blackwood was steering the conversation in a different direction. Aldrich, I was hoping we might have a private word. There are some matters of mutual interest I'd like to discuss. The private word, Aldrich knew, would be another attempt to convince him that marriage to Lady Catherine was the solution to all his problems. The prospect filled him with a weariness that had nothing to do with the early hour. As the group began to move toward his study, Aldrich caught Leora's eye. What he saw there, understanding, sympathy, and something that might have been possessive concern, gave him a strange comfort. For the first time in years, he wasn't facing these pressures entirely alone. The bronze bell that crowned the village church had remained silent for 3 years, its voice stilled not by damage or neglect, but by the gradual erosion of community spirit that had followed Aldrich's withdrawal from village life. Now, as urgent, word spread from cottage to cottage about the sickness approaching from the eastern settlements. That same bell suddenly rang with desperate urgency, its deep tones echoing across the countryside like a call to battle. Aldrich stood in the castle courtyard, watching smoke rise from signal fires on distant hills, the ancient warning system that told of plague moving closer with each passing day. The news had arrived with a merchant's wagon. 3 villages to the east had been struck by a fever that killed within days, leaving behind empty houses and mass graves. "How long do we have?" he asked Thomas, who had just returned from speaking with the merchant. "A week, perhaps 2 if we're fortunate," the old groom replied grimly. "The sickness moves slower in cold weather, but it moves all the same." Leora emerged from the castle's main entrance, her arms full of cloth bundles and her expression focused with the intensity of someone preparing for war. She had spent the morning consulting every medical text in the library and organizing supplies, with the methodical efficiency of a field commander. "Your Grace," she said without preamble, "we need to talk to the village immediately. There are preparations that must be made if we hope to minimize casualties." "What kind of preparations?" Lord Blackwood's voice carried a note of skepticism as he approached with his party. They had remained as overnight guests, ostensibly to enjoy the hunting, though Aldrich suspected Edmund was waiting for an opportunity to press his matrimonial agenda. "Quarantine procedures," Leora replied without hesitation. "Isolation protocols for the sick, sanitation measures for those who remain healthy, and medical supplies positioned where they can do the most good." Lady Catherine wrinkled her nose. Delicately, Surely such matters are best left to physicians. I'm sure the authorities in the county seat will send proper medical assistance. The county physician is 3 days' ride away, Leora said patiently. Even if he were willing to risk exposure by coming here, which is unlikely, the sick would be dead before help arrived. We are the authorities here, Lady Catherine. If we don't act, no one will. Marcus Blackwood stepped forward with the swagger of someone accustomed to being heard. Miss Ashworth, while your concern is commendable, surely you're not suggesting that Duke Thorne risk his life mingling with plague-infected peasants. The duchy needs its lord healthy and protected. The casual dismissal of the villagers as expendable sparked something dangerous in Leora's eyes. The duchy needs its lord to be a leader, Lord Marcus. Protecting yourself while your people die isn't leadership, it's cowardice. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Aldrich stepped between them. Miss Ashworth is right, he said quietly. My people look to me for protection and guidance. I won't abandon them to save myself. Lord Blackwood's expression grew calculating. Aldrich, be reasonable. You have no heir. If you die of plague, Ravenshollow dies with you. Is that really what's best for your people? The argument was logical, even compelling, but as Aldrich looked into Leora's eyes, he saw something that made his decision easy. She believed in him, not just as a duke, but as a man capable of rising to meet his responsibilities even when the cost was high. We'll convene the village council immediately, he decided. Miss Ashworth, what do you need from me? Her smile was radiant with relief and something deeper. Pride, perhaps, or recognition. Your authority, your grace. People will listen to medical advice more readily if it comes with ducal backing. Within the hour, the great hall had been transformed into an impromptu council chamber. The village elder, a white-haired man named Geoffrey, sat at the head table with several other local leaders. Farmers, craftsmen and merchants filled the remaining seats, their faces grave with the weight of approaching catastrophe. Leora stood before them with quiet confidence, her simple dress and practical manner lending credibility to her words. She had shed any pretense of subservience, revealing the natural authority that came from knowledge and genuine concern for others' welfare. The sickness approaching us is likely what physicians call the sweating fever, she began. It spreads through close contact with the infected, contaminated food or water, and possibly through the air itself. Our survival depends on limiting its spread once it arrives. And how do we do that? Asked the blacksmith, a burly man named William, whose hands were permanently stained with soot. Isolation of the sick in designated buildings away from the main population. Immediate burning of contaminated clothing and bedding. Boiling of all drinking water and careful disposal of waste. Leora's voice carried the calm authority of someone who had studied such matters extensively. Most importantly, we need to identify symptoms early and act quickly. An older woman near the back of the hall raised her hand tentatively. Begging your pardon, miss, but who are you to be telling us how to fight plague? Are you a physician? It was a fair question, and Aldrich watched to see how Leora would handle the challenge to her authority. She didn't bristle or assert superior knowledge. Instead, she acknowledged the concern with respectful honesty. I'm a healer trained by one of the wisest women I've ever known, she said. I've studied every account of plague management I could find, and I've seen what happens when communities are unprepared for epidemic disease. I'm not asking you to trust my credentials. I'm asking you to consider whether my suggestions make sense. The simple honesty of her approach seemed to resonate with the gathering. These were practical people who valued competence over titles, and Leora's straightforward manner spoke to them in ways that noble rhetoric never could. What about supplies? Geoffrey asked. Medicine, clean cloth for bandages, food for the healthy? I've taken inventory of what we have and what we'll need, Leora replied, producing a written list. We have enough basic medical supplies for Perhaps 50 serious cases, assuming we can supplement with herbs from the garden and surrounding countryside. Food stores are adequate if we implement rationing immediately. Lord Blackwood, who had been listening with growing displeasure, finally interrupted. This is all very thorough, but surely you're being overly pessimistic. Plagues often burn themselves out before reaching isolated communities like this one. They also often kill half the population when they do arrive, Leora replied without heat. I prefer to prepare for the worst and hope for the best, and if your preparations prove unnecessary, Marcus challenged. All this effort and expense for nothing? Leora turned to face him directly, her green eyes steady and unflinching. Then we'll have lost some time and resources, Lord Marcus, but we'll still have our lives, our families, and our community. That seems like a worthwhile trade to me. The logic was unassailable, and even Marcus seemed to recognize it. Gradually, the discussion shifted from whether to prepare to how best to organize the effort. Working groups were formed, one for medical supplies, another for food distribution, a third for sanitation and quarantine facilities. Aldrich found himself watching Leora with growing admiration as she fielded questions, offered suggestions, and coordinated the complex logistics of community defense. This was the woman who had spent 18 years preparing to return to him, not just as a bride, but as a partner capable of standing beside him in crisis. Your Grace, Geoffrey's voice drew his attention back to the proceedings. Miss Ashworth suggests converting the old granary into an isolation hospital. Do we have your permission to proceed? You have my full authorization, Aldrich replied. Whatever Miss Ashworth recommends, you may consider as having ducal approval. The declaration sent a murmur through the hall. By publicly backing Leora's authority, he was effectively making her his representative in this crisis, a role that carried significant political implications. Lord Blackwood's face darkened with disapproval. Aldrich, perhaps we should discuss this privately. There's nothing to discuss, Aldrich said firmly. Miss Ashworth has demonstrated expertise in exactly the area where we need guidance. I trust her judgment. As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse to their assigned tasks, Leora approached him with an expression of gratitude mixed with something deeper. Thank you for supporting me, she said quietly. I know that couldn't have been easy with your guests questioning every decision. You were right, he replied simply. Leadership means making hard choices and standing by them. I'd forgotten that for a while. And now? Eldrick looked around the hall, where villagers were already organizing themselves into working groups with purpose and determination he hadn't seen in years. The bronze bell outside continued its steady tolling, but now it sounded less like a warning of doom and more like a call to unity. Now I remember why I became Duke in the first place, he said. To serve something larger than myself, as they worked side by side in the hours that followed, preparing defenses against an invisible enemy. Aldrich felt something fundamental shifting in his relationship with both Leora and his role as leader. The approaching plague was a threat, but it was also an opportunity to prove himself worthy of the trust she had placed in him, and to rebuild the bonds between himself and his people that grief had nearly severed. Outside, the bell continued, its urgent song, calling the community together in the face of mortal danger, and for the first time in years, Aldrich felt ready to answer that call. The plague arrived on a grey morning 3 days ahead of even the most pessimistic predictions, carried by a half-dead merchant who collapsed at the village gates with fever-bright eyes and skin that burned to the touch. By nightfall, 2 more cases had been confirmed, and the isolation protocols Leora had established were put to their first desperate test. Aldrich stood in the doorway of the makeshift hospital, watching her move between the sick with the calm competence of someone who had been born for such work. She wore a simple linen mask over her nose and mouth, her hair covered by a practical cap, her movements economical and sure as she administered medications and monitored symptoms. You should be wearing protection, she said without looking up. From the patient she was examining, a young mother whose fever had spiked dangerously during the afternoon. "As should you," he replied, though he made no move to leave. "I have responsibilities here." "As do I." She finally looked at him, and even through the mask he could see the weight of worry in her eyes. "This is different, Your Grace. If you die, if I hide in my castle while my people suffer and die, I'll be dead in every way that matters." He stepped into the room, pulling on the gloves she had insisted all caregivers wear. "What can I do to help?" For a moment she simply stared at him, and he wondered if she was going to argue further. Then her shoulders relaxed slightly, and he caught a glimpse of relief in her expression. "The water barrels need refilling with boiled water only," she said, "and we need more clean linens from the castle. Martha has been preparing them, but we're going through supplies faster than expected." Working beside her in the makeshift hospital, Aldrich gained a new appreciation for both her skill and her courage. She treated each patient with the same careful attention, regardless of their station. The merchant who had brought the plague received the same quality of care as the village children who had been infected by contact with contaminated goods. "How did you learn to be so calm in the face of suffering?" he asked during a brief respite when they stepped outside for fresh air. "My aunt taught me that panic is a luxury healers can't afford," Leora replied, removing her mask to breathe more easily. "Fear is natural, but it has to be controlled, channeled into useful action rather than paralysis. And the fear, how do you control it?" She was quiet for a moment, looking toward the castle where warm lights flickered in the windows. "I remind myself that every person we save is someone's entire world. Every life preserved is a victory against despair." Her words carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, and Aldrich found himself studying her profile in the dim light. When had she become so beautiful to him? Not just in the obvious ways, though her features were lovely enough, but in the deeper sense of someone whose character had been refined by purpose and dedication. "Leora," he said, her name feeling natural on his lips for the first time since her return. She turned to look at him, and something in his tone made her expression grow more serious. "Yes, when this is over, when we've beaten back this plague and saved who we can save, I want to tell you something I should have said days ago." "What?" she asked softly. Before he could answer, shouts from the hospital interrupted them. They rushed back inside to find the young mother's condition had worsened dramatically. Her fever had spiked even higher, and her breathing had become labored and irregular. "Get me willow bark tea, as strong as you can make it," Leora commanded, her calm shattered by urgency. "And cold cloths. We need to bring her temperature down immediately." For the next hour, they fought for the woman's life with every skill and resource at their disposal. Aldrich found himself holding the patient steady while Leora worked, his hands gentle but firm as she administered medications and monitored vital signs. "Come on, Sarah," Leora murmured, her voice carrying both professional detachment and deep personal investment. "You have children who need you. You have a husband who loves you. Fight." Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the woman's breathing began to ease. Her fever broke near midnight, leaving her weak but clearly past the crisis point. As dawn approached, she opened her eyes and asked for water in a voice that was hoarse but steady. "She'll live," Leora said, the relief in her voice nearly palpable. "The fever's broken cleanly. She should make a full recovery." They emerged from the hospital into the pale light of early morning, both exhausted but triumphant. Aldrich felt a strange lightness in his chest, as if some weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had suddenly been lifted. "You saved her," he said. "We saved her," Leora corrected. "I couldn't have managed alone." The simple acknowledgement of their partnership struck him with unexpected force. When had he last felt this sense of shared accomplishment, of working towards something greater than his own survival or comfort? "You wanted to tell me something?" she said, settling onto a wooden bench outside the hospital, before Sarah took a turn for the worse. Aldrich sat beside her, suddenly aware of how close they were, how naturally they had fallen into working. As a team, The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of herbs from the garden and the distant promise of rain. "I wanted to tell you that I love you," he said simply, "not as the fulfillment of a childhood promise, not as a solution to political problems, but as the remarkable woman you've become." The words hung between them, honest and unguarded, in a way that would have terrified him just weeks earlier. Leora's eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed to struggle for words. "Aldrich," she said finally, and hearing his name on her lips, without the formal title, sent warmth spreading through his chest. "I've loved you since I was 6 years old. Not the idea of you, not the memory, but you. The man who showed kindness to a frightened child, who has grown into someone worth loving completely." When he kissed her, it was with the gentle reverence of someone who had finally found what he hadn't even realized he was searching for. Her lips were soft and warm beneath his, and when she kissed him back, he felt the last of his defenses crumble. They might have stayed there forever, lost in the wonder of acknowledged love. But the sound of approaching hoofbeats brought them reluctantly back to awareness. Lord Blackwood rode into the village with his son and a small party of armed men, their faces grim with purpose. "Aldrich," Blackwood called as he dismounted. "Thank God you're still alive. We've come to escort you to safety." "What are you talking about?" Aldrich stood, instinctively moving to shield Leora from whatever confrontation was approaching. "The plague, man! Surely you don't intend to remain here while disease ravages the countryside." Blackwood's voice carried the sharp edge of someone whose authority had been questioned. "We've prepared quarters at Blackwood Manor. You'll be safe there until this crisis passes." "I'm not leaving my people," Aldrich replied firmly. "My place is here." Marcus stepped forward, his expression ugly with barely controlled anger. "Your place is ensuring the continuation of your line, Your Grace. And that means staying alive long enough to marry properly and produce an heir." The emphasis on properly was clearly directed at Leora, and Aldrich felt his own temper beginning to rise. "I'll marry whom I choose, when I choose, Lord Marcus. Your opinion on the matter is neither requested nor welcome." "Your opinion may not be the only one that matters," Lord Blackwood said coldly. "There are those who question whether a duke who consorts with peasants and risks his life for commoners is fit to hold his position." The threat was unmistakable, and Aldrich felt the political ground shifting beneath his feet. Blackwood had connections at court, influence with the king's advisors. If he chose to make trouble, let them question, Leora said quietly, rising to stand beside Aldrich. "A leader who abandons his people in their hour of greatest need has already answered the question of his fitness to rule." Her hand found his, and Aldrich felt strength flow between them. Not just physical comfort, but the deeper support of someone who understood the choices he faced and stood ready to face them together. "This conversation isn't over," Blackwood warned, remounting his horse. "There will be consequences for these decisions, Aldrich. Consider that carefully." As the party rode away, Aldrich squeezed Leora's hand gently. "Are you certain you want to bind yourself to a man whose political future may be measured in days rather than years?" Her smile was radiant with certainty. "I'm certain I want to stand beside the man who chooses duty over safety, love over convenience, and people over politics. Whatever consequences that brings, we'll face them together." The signet ring on his finger, the symbol of his authority as Duke, caught the morning light as he lifted their joined hands to his lips. For the first time since inheriting the title, he felt worthy of the responsibility it represented. The plague still raged, political enemies were gathering, and the future remained uncertain, but he was no longer facing any of it alone. The royal summons arrived on a morning when the plague had finally begun to retreat, carried by a messenger whose elaborate court dress seemed almost obscene against the backdrop of a village still burying its dead. The parchment bore the king's seal and a command that brooked no refusal. Duke Aldrich Thorne was to present himself at court within a fortnight to answer questions regarding his fitness to rule. Aldrich read the summons twice, his jaw tightening. With each word, The formal language couldn't disguise the threat beneath. Lord Blackwood had made good on his promise to seek political recourse for what he saw as Aldrich's poor judgment. "How bad is it?" Leora asked quietly. She had been organizing the final cleanup of the hospital when the messenger arrived, and her practical dress and tired eyes spoke to the weeks of exhausting work they had both endured. "Bad enough." Aldrich handed her the parchment. "Edmund has convinced the king that I'm unfit to rule because I risked my life among plague victims and elevated a commoner to a position of authority." Leora's face paled as she read, but her voice remained steady. "Then we'll go to court and defend your actions. We saved lives, Aldrich. Surely that counts for something." "We?" He caught her hand, squeezing gently. "Leora, this could destroy everything. If the king rules against me, I could lose the duchy entirely. I won't drag you down with me." Before she could respond, the messenger cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but there's more. His Majesty has also commanded the presence of one Leora Ashworth, late of this duchy, for questioning regarding her background and recent activities." The words hit like a physical blow. They weren't just questioning Aldrich's judgment. They were investigating Leora herself, treating her as a potential threat to the realm's stability. "This is my fault," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I hadn't returned, if I hadn't pushed you to engage with the village, if you hadn't returned, half the village would be dead." Aldrich interrupted firmly. "Don't you dare take responsibility for other men's political maneuvering." The journey to the royal court took 4 days, during which they travelled in a silence heavy with unspoken fears. Leora had insisted on coming despite Aldrich's protests, arguing that running would only confirm whatever suspicions had been raised about her character and motives. The capital was a sprawling city of stone and ambition, where power flowed through. Elaborate ceremonies and whispered conversations in shadowed alcoves. The royal palace rose above it all, like a monument to divine authority, its towers reaching toward heaven as if to remind visitors of the sacred nature of kingship. They were given separate quarters, a pointed reminder of the social distance. The court perceived between them and summoned to appear before the king's council the following morning. Aldrich spent the night pacing his chambers, reviewing arguments and counter-arguments, preparing for a battle he wasn't certain he could win. The throne room was designed to intimidate, with its soaring ceilings and elaborate tapestries depicting royal victories throughout history. King Edward sat on his golden throne, with the weariness of a man who had ruled for 30 years and seen too much of human nature to be easily impressed by anything. Lord Blackwood stood to one side with several other court officials, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes bright with anticipation. Beside him, Marcus wore the smug look of someone confident in his family's political maneuvering. "Duke Thorne," the king's voice echoed in the vast space. "You stand accused of reckless endangerment of your position, elevation of inappropriate persons to authority, and general unfitness to hold your ducal rank. How do you answer these charges?" Aldrich stepped forward, every lesson in courtly protocol coming back to him despite the years of rural isolation. "Your Majesty, I answer that I fulfilled my duties as Duke by protecting my people from plague and ensuring the survival of my duchy. If that constitutes unfitness, then I stand proudly guilty." A murmur ran through the assembled courtiers. It was not the humble submission they had expected, and Aldrich could see several nobles exchanging meaningful glances. And what of the woman? The king's gaze moved to Leora, who stood with quiet dignity despite the obviously hostile atmosphere. "Lord Blackwood tells us you have elevated a peasant of questionable background to a position of influence. Explain this decision." "Miss Ashworth's actions during the plague crisis saved dozens of lives," Aldrich replied. "Her medical knowledge, organizational skills, and dedication to duty proved invaluable. I would trust her judgment above that of many nobles I have known." Strong words for a commoner. observed Lord Chancellor Hartwell, a thin man with calculating eyes. Tell me, Miss Ashworth, what qualifies you to advise a duke on matters of governance? Leora stepped forward with the same fearless directness she had shown as a child. Experience, my lord, 18 years of preparation and a genuine desire to serve the people of Raven's Hollow. Preparation for what, precisely? The Chancellor's tone suggested he already knew the answer would be damaging. To fulfill a promise I made as a child, to marry Duke Thorn and help him rule wisely. The admission sent a ripple of shocked whispers through the court. Several ladies covered their mouths in scandalized delight, while the male nobles exchanged looks of derision and disbelief. A peasant child presuming to promise marriage to a duke? Lord Blackwood's voice dripped with disdain. Your Majesty, surely this confirms the inappropriate nature of their relationship. The woman is clearly delusional, possibly dangerous. Enough. The king's command silenced the growing murmur of conversation. Lord Hartwell, what have your investigations revealed about Miss Ashworth's background? The Chancellor consulted. A thick sheaf of documents, his expression growing increasingly puzzled. Your Majesty, the investigation has uncovered some unusual circumstances. It appears Miss Ashworth's parentage is not what it initially seemed. Aldrich felt a chill of premonition. Beside him, Leora had gone very still, her face pale but composed. Explain, the king commanded. According to church records and witness testimony we have gathered, the people who raised Miss Ashworth as their daughter were not her biological parents. She was brought to them as an infant by parties unknown, with only a few personal effects, and a considerable sum of gold for her care. The throne room had fallen into absolute silence. Aldrich could hear his own heartbeat as the implications of the Chancellor's words began to sink in. Furthermore, Hartwell continued, examination of those personal effects which the family preserved despite their poverty reveals heraldic symbols consistent with the House of Ravencrest. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. The House of Ravencrest had been one of the most powerful ducal families in the realm until it was destroyed in a succession war 24 years earlier. Everyone present knew the story, how Duke Edmund Ravencrest and his entire family had been killed when rival claimants to his title had attacked his castle. That's impossible, Lord Blackwood sputtered. The Ravencrest line was extinguished. There were no survivors. So it was believed, the Chancellor agreed gravely. However, further investigation has revealed that Duke Edmund's infant daughter, Helena, was never found among the dead. She disappeared during the attack and was presumed killed, her body lost in the destruction. The king leaned forward on his throne, his expression intense with interest. Are you suggesting that this woman is Helena Ravencrest? The evidence is compelling, Your Majesty. The timing aligns perfectly. The heraldic items are authentic, and Hartwell paused dramatically. There is a birthmark on Miss Ashworth's shoulder that matches the description recorded by the Ravencrest family physician for the infant. Helena, Leora swayed slightly, and Aldrich moved instinctively to steady her. Her face had gone white with shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. This is madness, she whispered. I'm a healer's apprentice from Northford. I'm not. The Ravencrest holdings, the king mused, seemingly oblivious to Leora's distress, were some of the richest in the realm before the succession war. If this young woman is truly Helena Ravencrest, she outranks nearly everyone in this room. The political implications were staggering. As the rightful heir to Ravencrest, Leora wouldn't just be noble, she would be one of the highest-ranking peers in the kingdom, with a claim to vast estates and enormous wealth that had been held in royal trust for over 2 decades. Your Majesty, Lord Blackwood said desperately, surely we cannot take such claims seriously without absolute proof. The proof appears quite convincing, the king interrupted. Lady Helena, the title fell like a thunderbolt in the silent chamber. Do you remember anything of your early childhood? Any memories that might confirm or deny these findings? Leora, Helena, shook her head numbly. Nothing clear. Sometimes I dream of a great hall with banners, but I thought they were just fantasies. Aldrich felt the world tilting around him as the full magnitude of the revelation sank in. The woman he loved, the peasant girl who had kept a childhood promise, was actually one of the most powerful nobles in the realm. Their love story had just become a political earthquake. "This changes everything," the king said with obvious satisfaction. The marriage between Duke Thorn and Lady Helena Ravencrest would unite two of the most significant holdings in the kingdom. Far from being an inappropriate match, it would be highly advantageous to the realm. Lord Blackwood's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. His careful political maneuvering had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly, elevating the very woman he had sought to destroy. "But your Majesty," Marcus protested weakly, "surely the lady needs time to adjust to her new circumstances, to learn proper deportment and—" "The lady," Helena said quietly, finding her voice at last, "needs time to understand who she really is." She looked at Aldrich with eyes that held confusion, wonder, and something that might have been fear. "I came here as Leora Ashworth, determined to keep a promise made by a peasant child. I don't know how to be Lady Helena Ravencrest." The king smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since the proceedings began. "You'll learn, my dear. You'll have excellent teachers and unlimited resources. More importantly, you'll have a husband who loves you for who you are, not what you can bring him." As the court session concluded, with elaborate ceremonies to formally recognize Helena's restored title and rights, Aldrich found himself struggling with emotions he couldn't name. Joy that their love was no longer forbidden, confusion about how everything had changed so quickly, and an underlying fear that the woman he had fallen in love with might disappear beneath the weight of noble expectations. "Are you still you?" he asked her later, when they were finally alone in the chambers now befitting her elevated status. Helena, he was still learning to think of her by that name, looked down at the elegant gown court protocol demanded she wear, at the jewels that marked her rank, at the formal arrangements that would govern her life from now on. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I know I still love you. I know I still want to help the people of Ravenshollow. But everything else—" She gestured helplessly at her surroundings. "This isn't the life I prepared for." "Then we'll figure it out together," Aldrich said, taking her hands in his. "The same way we've figured out everything else." The hidden royal decree that had revealed her true identity lay on the table between them, a piece of parchment that had rewritten their entire story in a single moment. But as Aldrich looked into her eyes, he saw the same fearless determination that had captivated him in a 6-year-old child and fallen in love with in a determined woman. The names might change, the circumstances might transform, but the heart remained constant, and perhaps he thought that was enough to build a future on. The week following Helena's recognition as Lady Ravencrest passed in a whirlwind of political maneuvering that left both her and Aldrich feeling like pieces on a chessboard controlled by unseen masters. The king, delighted by the romantic and political possibilities of their union, had immediately begun planning a wedding that would serve multiple purposes, celebrating the restoration of an ancient noble line, cementing valuable political alliances, and providing the realm with a spectacle worthy of royal approval. But with each passing day, Helena seemed to retreat further into herself, overwhelmed by the expectations and responsibilities that came. With her newfound status, the simple brown dresses she preferred were replaced by elaborate court gowns, her days filled with lessons in protocol and precedents from stern-faced instructors who clearly doubted her ability to transform from healer to duchess. Lady Helena, the protocol mistress, a formidable woman named Lady Pemberton, said with barely concealed exasperation during one particularly trying lesson, "You simply cannot continue to speak to servants as if they were your equals. There are proper channels, established hierarchies that must be observed." Helena sat rigidly in the uncomfortable chair that had been deemed appropriate for her station, her hands folded in her lap as she had been taught, her natural warmth and directness slowly being trained out of her by endless corrections and criticisms. "I understand the importance of protocol," she replied carefully, "but surely kindness costs nothing, regardless of rank. Kindness is a luxury that those in power can ill afford." Lady Pemberton sniffed. "Familiarity breeds contempt, my lady. If you wish to command respect, you must maintain proper distance." From his position near the window, Aldrich watched the exchange with growing unease. Each lesson seemed to chip away at something essential in Helena's character, replacing her natural confidence with careful calculation, her genuine warmth with polite reserve. "Perhaps we might continue this lesson tomorrow," he interrupted, unable to bear seeing her diminished any further. "Lady Helena has had a long day." Lady Pemberton's expression suggested she found his interference inappropriate, but she inclined her head with grudging deference. "Of course, Your Grace, though I must stress that time is of the essence. The wedding is less than a fortnight away, and there is still so much to learn." After the protocol mistress departed, Helena remained seated in the formal chair, staring at her hands with an expression of such profound sadness that Aldrich's heart ached for her. "This isn't what you wanted," he said gently, settling into the chair beside hers. "I don't know what I wanted anymore," she replied, without looking up. "I thought I knew who I was, what I was capable of. Now everyone tells me I was wrong about everything. How I should speak, how I should move, how I should think. They're trying to turn me into someone else entirely." "You're still you," Aldrich said firmly. "Titles and training can't change the art of who you are, can't they?" Helena finally met his gaze, and he saw genuine fear in her green eyes. "Sometimes I catch myself calculating my words before I speak, considering the political implications of every gesture. What if I become so focused on being the perfect duchess that I forget how to be the woman you fell in love with?" Before Aldrich could respond, a commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention. Through the window, they could see Lord Blackwood arriving with a larger party than before. Not just his son, but several other nobles whose presence suggested serious political business. "Edmund looks determined," Helena observed, with a weariness that spoke to the constant pressure they had both been under. "He hasn't given up," Aldrich agreed grimly. "Finding out you're Lady Ravencrest only made him more desperate to prevent our marriage. If we wed, it consolidates too much power in families he can't control." A servant appeared in the doorway with a formal bow. "Your Grace, Lady Helena, His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the throne room. Lord Blackwood has raised urgent matters requiring your attention." As they made their way through the palace corridors, Helena's court-trained posture seemed to weigh on her like armor she hadn't chosen to wear. Her steps were measured, her expression carefully composed, but Aldrich could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tremor in her hands. The throne room was arranged for formal proceedings, with the king seated in state, while Lord Blackwood stood with his allies in a formation that suggested coordinated strategy. Several court officials flanked the throne, their expressions ranging from curious to concerned. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said, bowing appropriately while Helena executed a perfect curtsy that would have pleased even Lady Pemberton. "Ah, the happy couple," the king said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Lord Blackwood has raised some concerns about your upcoming union that require clarification." Blackwood stepped forward with the confidence of a man playing his final, strongest card. "Your Majesty, while no one questions Lady Helena's noble birth or her right to her titles, we must consider whether this marriage truly serves the realm's best interests." "Explain," the king commanded, though his tone suggested growing impatience with Blackwood's continued interference. "The lady has spent her entire adult life as a commoner," Blackwood said with feigned concern. "She has no experience in court, politics, no understanding of the complex alliances that govern our realm. To place such enormous holdings under the control of someone so inexperienced could destabilize the very foundations of our political order. Murmurs of agreement came from several of Blackwood's allies, and Aldrich felt the familiar chill of political maneuvering beyond his control. Furthermore, Marcus added, stepping forward with his father, there are questions about Lady Helena's associations, her choice to work as a common healer, her involvement with plague victims, her apparent disregard for proper social boundaries. Are these the qualities we want in someone who will control such vast resources? The accusations were carefully crafted to sound like legitimate concerns rather than personal attacks, but their intent was clear: to paint Helena as unfit for the responsibilities that came with her heritage. Helena stood silent throughout the assault on her character, her training in court protocol apparently having included lessons in maintaining dignity under political fire. But Aldrich could see the cost of that composure in the rigid set of her jaw, the careful control of her breathing. These are serious concerns, the king mused, though his expression suggested he was more annoyed than convinced. Lady Helena, how do you respond to these questions about your readiness for such responsibilities? Helena stepped forward with the careful grace her instructors had drilled into her, but when she spoke, her voice carried none of the calculated political rhetoric they had tried to teach her. Your Majesty, I cannot claim extensive experience in court politics or noble alliances, she said with simple honesty, but I can claim something perhaps more valuable, a genuine understanding of what good governance means to the people it serves. I've seen what happens when leaders prioritize political advantage over human welfare, and I have seen what can be accomplished when they choose differently. Her words carried the conviction of lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge, and several courtiers seemed to respond to their authenticity. Pretty words, Blackwood said dismissively, but the realm requires more than good intentions. It requires experience, connections, understanding of how power truly functions. And if those things come at the cost of compassion and wisdom, Helena replied, her composure beginning to crack as her natural fire reasserted itself. If the price of political sophistication is the ability to ignore suffering when it's inconvenient, then perhaps the realm needs leaders who remember that power exists to serve, not to preserve itself. The exchange had drawn them into the kind of philosophical debate that courtiers usually avoided in favor of more practical considerations. But Aldrich could see that Helena's passionate defense of her values was resonating with some of those present. The lady speaks well, observed Lord Chancellor Hartwell, but Lord Blackwood raises valid concerns about preparedness. Perhaps a compromise might be appropriate. The king leaned forward with interest. What kind of compromise? A trial period, Hartwell suggested. Let Lady Helena assume provisional control of a portion of her holdings, perhaps the smaller estates, while continuing her education in governance. If she proves capable over, say, 6 months, then the full inheritance and marriage could proceed as planned. It was a reasonable-sounding proposal that would effectively delay their wedding while subjecting Helena to months of additional scrutiny and political pressure. Aldrich could see the trap clearly, even if it was presented as a fair test. Your Majesty, he said before Helena could respond, with respect, this proposal seems designed more to appease Lord Blackwood's concerns than to serve justice. Lady Helena has already proven her capability through her actions during the plague crisis. To subject her to additional trials suggests doubt about her legitimacy rather than concern for her readiness. You would say that, Marcus sneered. You benefit from the marriage regardless of the lady's fitness to rule. The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and Aldrich felt his temper flare despite years of diplomatic training. But before he could respond, Helena stepped forward with a dignity that commanded attention. Enough, she said quietly, but with such authority that the entire room fell silent. I will not stand here and listen to my character, my capabilities, or my motives questioned by men who measure worth only in political convenience. She turned to face the king directly, abandoning the careful deference her instructors had demanded. Your Majesty, I accept your recognition of my birthright and the responsibilities that come with it, but I will not accept conditions that suggest I must prove my worth to those who seek to profit from my failure." The throne room had fallen into absolute silence. Helena's words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and Aldrich felt his heart swell with pride and love for the woman who had found her voice again in the moment that mattered most. "I will marry Duke Thorn as planned," she continued, "not because it serves political expediency, but because we love each other and share a vision of what good leadership can accomplish. If that troubles those who prefer their nobles compliant and manageable, then perhaps they need to examine their own understanding of what nobility truly means." The king stared at her for a long moment, and Aldrich held his breath as he tried to read the royal expression. Then, slowly, a smile spread across the monarch's face. "Well said, Lady Helena," he declared. "It appears the realm has gained not just a restored noble line, but a leader who remembers that true nobility lies in character rather than mere breeding." The ancient wedding crown that had been retrieved from the Ravencrest family treasures sat in its place of honor, a circlet of silver and gold intertwined with thorns and roses, symbols of the pain and beauty that love could bring. As Helena looked at it during the final preparations for their ceremony, Aldrich saw both anticipation and trepidation in her expression. "Are you ready?" he asked gently. "I'm ready to marry you," she replied with a smile that reminded him of the fearless child who had promised to return. "Everything else we'll figure out as we go." Tomorrow they would face whatever challenges their union might bring, but tonight they had each other, and the certainty that their love had survived every test that politics and circumstance could devise. The morning of the wedding dawned with an unseasonable warmth that seemed to promise hope after the long months of uncertainty and struggle. In the palace chapel, nobles from across the realm had gathered to witness what many were calling the most significant union in a generation, the marriage of two ancient houses that would reshape the political landscape of the kingdom. Helena stood before her mirror in the bridal chamber, wearing the simple white gown she had chosen, despite the court's preference for elaborate ceremony. The wedding crown of thorns and roses rested on a velvet cushion nearby, its intertwined precious metals catching the morning light like captured promises. "You look beautiful, my lady," Martha said softly, having travelled from Ravenshollow to serve at the wedding. The old housekeeper's presence was a comfort, a reminder of the life and love that had brought them to this moment. "I feel like I'm wearing someone else's skin," Helena confessed, smoothing the unfamiliar silk with nervous hands. "This morning I am Lady Helena Ravencrest, about to become Duchess Thorn. But inside, I still feel like Leora Ashworth, the girl who made an impossible promise." "Perhaps that's exactly who you're meant to be," Martha suggested gently. "Not one or the other, but all of it together. The promise, the healing, the nobility, the love. People are more than their titles, my lady." Before Helena could respond, urgent voices in the corridor outside drew their attention. Through the door, they could hear the sound of rapid footsteps and agitated conversation that spoke of crisis rather than celebration. "Lady Helena!" The voice belonged to Lord Chancellor Hartwell, and the urgency in it sent a chill through the room. "Your immediate presence is required in the King's private chamber. There has been a development." Helena's heart sank as she followed the Chancellor through corridors that suddenly seemed less festive than ominous. Whatever had happened was serious enough to interrupt a royal wedding ceremony, which meant it was serious enough to change everything. The King's private chamber was in chaos when she arrived. Aldrich stood near the window, his face grim with suppressed anger, while the King paced behind his desk with the energy of a man whose plans had been violently disrupted. Lord Blackwood sat in a chair near the fireplace, but his usual confidence had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. "Ah, Lady Helena," the king said as she entered, "please sit down. What I have to tell you may come as quite a shock." She remained standing, drawing strength from Aldrich's presence even as dread settled in her stomach. "What has happened, Your Majesty?" "It appears," the king said heavily, "that Lord Blackwood has made one final attempt to prevent your marriage. This morning, he presented evidence that he claims proves you are not, in fact, Helena Ravencrest." The words hit her like physical blows. After everything they had endured, all the recognition and acceptance, all the preparation for their new life together, someone was still trying to steal it away. "What evidence?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. Lord Blackwood rose from his chair with obvious reluctance, producing a scroll sealed with ancient wax. "I have here a document from the archives of Ravencrest Castle, sealed and authenticated before the castle's destruction 24 years ago. It details the circumstances of the infant Helena's death during the siege." The silence that followed was deafening. Helena felt the world tilting around her as the implications of his words sank in. If this document was genuine, if the real Helena Ravencrest had died as an infant, then everything, her titles, her inheritance, her right to marry Aldrich, was built on a lie. "That's convenient," Aldrich said, his voice cold with anger. "A document that contradicts all previous evidence, presented at the last possible moment to maximum dramatic effect. Why should anyone believe this is authentic?" "Because," Blackwood replied with renewed confidence, "it was authenticated by the royal archivists themselves. The seal is genuine. The parchment dates to the correct period, and the handwriting matches other documents known to be written by the Ravencrest family." Scribe. King Edward examined the document with the careful attention of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "The authentication appears legitimate," he said finally. "According to this record, the infant Helena died of fever 3 days before the siege began. Her body was buried in the family crypt, and the burial was witnessed by multiple retainers." Helena sank into a chair as the full impact of the revelation washed over her. She wasn't Lady Helena Ravencrest. She wasn't a lost noble heir restored to her rightful place. She was exactly what she had always believed herself to be. Leora Ashworth, the daughter of poor farmers, a woman whose only claim to significance was her skill as a healer and her love for a duke. "Then who am I?" she whispered. "The birthmark, the timing, the personal effects. How do you explain all of that?" "Coincidence," Blackwood said with obvious satisfaction, "or perhaps deliberate deception by those who raised you, hoping to profit from resemblance to a dead noble child. The world is full of people who dream of rising above their stations through fraud and manipulation." The accusation stung, but what hurt more was the growing certainty that he might be right. Had her adoptive parents known something they had never told her? Had they planted the seeds of an impossible dream, hoping that someday it might bear fruit? "Your Majesty," Aldrich said, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled fury, "with respect, the timing of this revelation is suspiciously convenient. Lord Blackwood has opposed this marriage from the beginning. Now, on the morning of the ceremony, he produces evidence that happens to support his position. This reeks of political manipulation." "Are you suggesting I forged royal documents?" Blackwood demanded, drawing himself up with wounded dignity. "That I somehow fabricated evidence authenticated by your own court officials?" "I'm suggesting," Aldrich replied coldly, "that you've spent months looking for any way to prevent this marriage, and that desperation makes men capable of remarkable creativity." The king held up a hand for silence, his expression grave with the weight of royal responsibility. "The evidence appears authentic, but you raise valid concerns about timing and motivation. However, we cannot ignore documented proof simply because it's inconvenient." Helena found her voice again, though it came out smaller than she intended. "What does this mean? For the marriage? For everything?" "It means," the king said gently, "that you are no longer Lady Helena Ravencrest. You have no claim to those titles or holdings. You are Miss Leora Ashworth, a commoner, and the political implications of Duke Thorne marrying a commoner are significant. The unspoken message was clear. The marriage that had been politically advantageous as a union between noble houses was now a potential scandal that could damage both Aldrich's position and the stability of the realm. "I see," Helena said quietly. "And Duke Thorne, what becomes of his position if he insists on this inappropriate marriage?" Before the king could answer, Aldrich stepped forward with the bearing of a man who had finally found the courage to fight for what mattered most. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice ringing with conviction, "I renounce my ducal title." The statement hit the room like a thunderclap. Even Blackwood looked stunned by the magnitude of Aldrich's declaration. "Aldrich, no!" Helena breathed, rising from her chair in alarm. "You can't. This is your heritage, your responsibility." "My responsibility," he said firmly, turning to face her with eyes that held no doubt, no regret, "is to the woman I love. If I must choose between my title and my heart, there is no choice at all." He drew the ancient sword of House Thorne from its ceremonial sheath, the blade that had been carried by his ancestors for generations. With deliberate solemnity, he laid it at the king's feet. "I relinquish all claims to the Duchy of Ravenshollow," he said formally. "Let it pass to whomever your Majesty deems worthy. I choose love over power, companionship over isolation, and a life of purpose over a life of mere privilege." The gesture was breathtaking in its finality. With a few words and one symbolic act, Aldrich had abandoned everything he had been born to inherit, everything that defined his place in the world. "You would give up everything for her?" the king asked, his voice filled with something that might have been wonder. "I would give up anything for her," Aldrich replied without hesitation. "She is worth more than all the titles and lands in the kingdom." Helena stared at him through tears she hadn't realized were falling, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his sacrifice and the depth of love it represented. But even as her heart soared with joy, her practical mind grappled with the reality of what he had done. "Aldrich," she said softly, "what about your people? What about Ravenshollow? They need you." "They need good leadership," he corrected gently. "That doesn't necessarily require noble blood or ancient titles. It requires someone who cares about their welfare and is willing to work for their betterment." The sword of House Thorne lay between them and the throne, a symbol of power abandoned for love. And in that moment, Helena realized that the man who had given up everything to be with her was exactly the man she had fallen in love with. Someone who understood that true nobility came from character, not birthright. The silence that followed Aldrich's renunciation stretched across the chamber like a held breath, heavy with the weight of irreversible decisions and their consequences. The sword of House Thorne gleamed on the floor between them and the throne, its polished steel reflecting the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. King Edward stared at the abandoned weapon for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the measured weight of 3 decades of rule. "In all my years as king," he said slowly, "I have seen men fight wars for titles, commit murder for inheritances, and sacrifice their children for political advantage. I have never seen a man voluntarily surrender everything he was born to possess for the sake of love." Lord Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly sensing that the dramatic gesture had not produced the result he had anticipated. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot allow such theatrical sentiment to influence matters of state. The duchy requires proper leadership, not romantic gestures." "The duchy," the king replied thoughtfully, "requires leadership that places service above self-interest. It seems to me that Duke Thorne," he paused significantly, "former Duke Thorne has just demonstrated exactly that quality." Helena felt her heart catch at the continued use of Aldrich's title, even as the king acknowledged his renunciation. Something in the royal tone suggested wheels turning, plans forming, possibilities being weighed that none of them had considered. "Your Majesty?" Helena asked carefully, not daring to hope but unable to ignore the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The king moved to the window, gazing out at the kingdom he had ruled for so long. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth, for that is your true name, is it not? What do you believe makes a good ruler?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, but Helena sensed its importance. "Wisdom, Your Majesty, compassion, the ability to see beyond immediate gain to long-term consequences, and above all, the understanding that power exists to serve others, not oneself. And you, Aldrich, though I suppose you are no longer Duke. Thorn, what qualities do you value in leadership?" Aldrich straightened, meeting the king's gaze directly despite his changed circumstances. "Courage, Your Majesty, the willingness to make difficult decisions for the right reasons, loyalty to those who depend on you, and the humility to recognize that true strength comes from lifting others up, not holding them down." King Edward nodded, slowly, as if their answers had confirmed something he had already suspected. "Edmund," he said, turning to Lord Blackwood, "you have spent considerable effort trying to convince me that this marriage would be inappropriate, that Miss Ashworth lacks the proper qualifications for nobility, that Duke Thorn has shown poor judgment in his choices." "Yes, Your Majesty," Blackwood replied, though his confidence seemed to be wavering. "Exactly so. And yet," the king continued with growing intensity, "in this very chamber I have witnessed more genuine nobility from these two individuals than I have seen from many who were born to it. I have watched a man willingly sacrifice everything for love, and a woman accept the loss of everything she thought she was, with grace and dignity." The king moved to his desk and withdrew an ornate goblet, the ceremonial unity cup that had been used in royal weddings for centuries. The ancient vessel required two people to drink from it simultaneously, symbolizing the joining of lives, destinies, and purposes. "There is an old law," he said, holding the goblet with reverent care, "largely forgotten but never officially repealed. It states that nobility can be granted not only by birth or royal decree, but by demonstrated virtue in service to the realm." Helena's breath caught as she began to understand what the king was suggesting. Beside her, Aldrich had gone very still, his attention focused entirely on the royal words. "The service you both provided during the plague crisis," the king continued, "your willingness to risk your lives for those under your protection, your demonstration of the very qualities that define true leadership, these constitute exactly the kind of service that ancient law was designed to recognize." Lord Blackwood rose from his chair with obvious alarm. "Your Majesty, surely you cannot mean to—" "I mean," the king said firmly, "to exercise my royal prerogative to recognize nobility where it has been earned rather than simply inherited." He looked directly at Helena, his expression warm with approval. "Miss Leora Ashworth, for your service to the realm and your demonstration of noble character, I hereby grant you the title of Lady Leora of Ravenshollow, with all the rights and privileges thereto." The words hit Helena like a physical shock, not the restoration of someone else's identity, but the recognition of her own worth, her own actions, her own character. She wasn't Lady Helena Ravencrest, she was Lady Leora, newly made noble by choice rather than accident of birth. "And you, Aldrich Thorn," the king continued, "I refuse to accept your renunciation of title. A man who would sacrifice everything for love and principle is exactly the kind of leader this realm needs. Your duchy is restored to you, along with my complete confidence in your judgment." The unity goblet gleamed between them as the king extended it toward the couple. "Now then, shall we proceed with this wedding? I believe we have kept the guests waiting quite long enough." Lord Blackwood made one final desperate attempt to salvage his position. "Your Majesty, this sets a dangerous precedent. If common birth can be overcome by royal whim, The king's voice carried a sharp edge that made Blackwood step back involuntarily. "Sir, I have witnessed courage, sacrifice, wisdom, and devotion, the very foundations upon which true nobility rests. If you consider the recognition of such qualities to be mere whim, then perhaps you need to examine your own understanding of what it means to be noble." The rebuke hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since Helena had met him, Lord Blackwood seemed truly speechless. His grand political maneuvering had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly, elevating the very people he had sought to diminish. Helena looked at Aldrich, seeing in his eyes the same wonder and joy that filled her own heart. They had faced every obstacle: social prejudice, political opposition, even the apparent loss of her identity, and emerged not just intact, but stronger. "Are you ready, Lady Leora?" Aldrich asked, offering her his arm with all the courtesy due. Her new rank. "I've been ready since I was 6 years old," she replied, her smile radiant with happiness and certainty. The unity goblet passed between them as they prepared to take the vows that would bind their lives together. But Helena realized that the most important promises had already been made and kept. The childhood vow that had brought her back to him, the commitment to serve others before themselves, and the dedication to face whatever challenges might come. With love as their foundation, the wedding crown of thorns and roses waited in the chapel, but the true symbols of their union were already present in this chamber. Courage, sacrifice, and the kind of love that transformed not just hearts, but the very meaning of nobility itself. As they prepared to leave for the ceremony, Helena caught sight of the abandoned sword of House Thorn, still lying where Aldrich had placed it at the king's feet. But she knew that the real power to lead came not from ancient weapons or inherited titles, but from the choice to serve something greater than oneself. And that was a choice they had both made long before this moment. She, as a 6-year-old, promising to return, he as a man willing to risk everything for the people he protected. Their love story was becoming a legacy, and their legacy would be written not in political victories or accumulated wealth, but in the lives they touched, and the example they set for others who dared to believe that character mattered more than circumstance. 1 year later, the Duchy of Raven's Hollow had transformed into something that would have seemed impossible during those dark days when plague threatened to destroy everything. Where once empty houses had stood like broken teeth along village streets, new families had settled, drawn by word of fair leadership and opportunities for honest work. The fields that had lain fallow for years now stretched green and gold, with healthy crops, tended by farmers who had returned from distant cities to reclaim their heritage. Aldrich stood at the same window, where he had once gazed upon decline and despair, but now the view filled him with quiet satisfaction. The morning market bustled with activity as merchants and craftsmen displayed their wares, while children played in streets that rang with laughter instead of echoing with emptiness. The transformation was remarkable, but more remarkable still was how natural it felt, as if this prosperity had always been waiting beneath the surface, needing only the right conditions to flourish. "The harvest reports are even better than we projected," Leora said, entering the study with a ledger tucked under her arm and dirt under her fingernails from her morning rounds in the expanded herb garden. A year of marriage had settled comfortably between them, deepening their partnership in ways that still surprised him daily. She wore a simple blue dress that marked her as nobility while remaining practical enough for the hands-on leadership style she had never abandoned. The elaborate court gowns gathered dust in her wardrobe, replaced by clothing that served her work rather than hindering it. "The new crop rotation methods are showing results faster than anyone expected," she continued, settling into the chair beside his desk with the easy familiarity of shared purpose. "And the soil improvement techniques from the old texts are proving their worth. We should see even better yields next season." Aldrich smiled at her enthusiasm, though after a year of watching her attack every challenge with the same determined competence, he shouldn't have been surprised by her success. The village elders want to hold a celebration feast when the harvest is complete. They're calling it the Festival of Renewal. That seems appropriate, Leora replied, though something in her tone suggested deeper thoughts. Everything here has been renewed, hasn't it? The land, the community, the castle, even us. It was true. The man who had spent years isolated by grief and the woman who had returned carrying an impossible promise had both grown into something new through their shared challenges and victories. The Duke who now led Ravenshollow bore little resemblance to the solitary figure who had once hidden behind duty and distance. "Speaking of renewal," Aldrich said, producing a rolled parchment sealed with official wax, "this arrived this morning, if from the capital." Leora accepted the document with the slight wariness that official correspondence still inspired, though their relationship with the royal court had remained positive since their wedding. The king had proven true to his word, supporting their unconventional approach to governance and even citing their success as an example to other nobles. As she read, her expression shifted from caution to surprise to something approaching wonder. "Aldrich, This is extraordinary. What is it?" "An invitation to advise the Royal Council on epidemic preparedness and rural development. The king wants us to help develop policies for the entire realm based on what we've accomplished here." She looked up from the letter with eyes bright with possibility. "They're asking us to teach others what we've learned." The recognition was gratifying. But more than that, it represented the opportunity to spread their approach beyond the borders of Ravenshollow. The marriage that had begun with a child's promise was becoming a partnership that could influence the future of the kingdom itself. "There's more," Leora said, continuing to read. "He's offering to fund the establishment of healing centers in rural areas throughout the realm, with us overseeing the program. Think of it, Aldrich. We could help dozens of communities that are struggling the way Ravenshollow was." The scope of the opportunity was breathtaking, but Aldrich found himself studying his wife's face rather than considering the political implications. The woman who had once questioned whether she could be worthy of nobility was now being asked to help shape policy for an entire kingdom. "You've come a long way from the girl who worried about learning proper court etiquette," he observed gently. Leora's smile was soft with memory and bright with confidence. "I've learned that nobility isn't about knowing which fork to use or how to curtsy properly. It's about using whatever gifts you have in service of something larger than yourself." A commotion in the courtyard below drew their attention to the window. A small group of travelers had arrived, and among them Aldrich recognized several faces from neighboring duchies, nobles who had come to see for themselves the transformation everyone was talking about. "More visitors wanting to learn our secrets," Leora said with gentle amusement. "Should we tell them the truth, that there's no secret, just hard work and genuine care for the people you serve?" "They probably won't believe us," Aldrich replied. "Most people prefer to think success comes from clever tricks rather than basic principles consistently applied." They made their way down to greet their guests, but not before Aldrich caught sight of something that made him pause. Hanging on the wall near the staircase was the new duchy banner they had commissioned, a design that combined elements from both their family histories with new symbols representing hope, healing, and renewal. The old banners had spoken of past glories and ancient achievements. This one spoke of present purpose and future possibilities. The afternoon passed in the familiar rhythm of showing visitors around the duchy, explaining their approaches to governance, and answering questions about everything from agricultural techniques to conflict resolution. Aldrich watched Leora field inquiries about medical training programs with the same natural authority she brought to discussing crop rotation, and marveled again at how perfectly she had grown into her role. As evening approached, and their guests settled into the accommodations Martha had prepared, Aldrich and Leora found themselves alone in the herb garden, where so much of their renewed relationship had taken root. The plants flourished in neat, purposeful rows, providing medicine for the local community and serving as a living laboratory for techniques they shared with other healers. "Do you ever miss it?" Aldrich asked, as they walked among the carefully tended beds. "The simplicity of the life you thought you were choosing when you returned here?" Leora considered the question seriously, as she did most things. "I miss the certainty," she said finally, "when I thought I was just Leora Ashworth. Keeping a childhood promise, life seemed more straightforward. But I don't miss the limitations that certainty imposed." She paused beside a thriving patch of chamomile, running her fingers gently over the delicate flowers. "I've learned that growth requires stepping into uncertainty, accepting responsibilities. You're not sure you're ready for becoming more than you thought you could be. Any regrets?" he asked, though he thought he knew the answer. "Only one," she replied, turning to face him with a smile that still had the power to stop his heart. "I regret that I waited 18 years to come back to you. Imagine what we might have accomplished with all that extra time." Aldrich pulled her into his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how natural it felt to hold the woman who had kept an impossible promise. "We accomplished exactly what we were meant to accomplish, exactly when we were meant to accomplish it. You came back when you were ready to be the partner I needed, and I was finally ready to be the man you deserved." As the sun set over their flourishing duchy, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they stood together in the garden that symbolized everything they had built: beauty and purpose growing from careful tending, patience and love. The child who had promised to marry a duke had become a woman who helped transform a kingdom. The grieving widower who had hidden from life had become a leader whose example inspired others to rediscover their own capacity for service and growth. Their story had begun with a simple promise made in innocence and kept through devotion. It continued now as a legacy of hope, proving that sometimes the smallest acts of faith could bloom into transformations that touched countless lives. And in the garden where new life grew from careful nurturing, where healing herbs flourished under patient care, the Duke and Duchess of Ravenshollow planned their next season of service, secure in the knowledge that the best promises were not just kept, but exceeded in ways that honored both the promise and the growth it made possible. The wooden ring Leora had worn as a child still hung on its chain around her neck, but beside it now hung the ducal seal, symbols of the journey from dream to reality, from promise to fulfillment, from two separate hearts to one shared purpose that would endure for all the seasons yet to come.